Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes. So hold tight. As you're coming into the room, we'd love if you would introduce yourself in the chat so that we know who's joining us today for this important conversation about privacy, security, and interoperability through the lens of procurement. Welcome. Great. So some folks from state ed, some folks from our SIS vendors. Welcome, Steve from Common Sense. Great. John High from Learn Platform. Utah Board of Education, Rep and Strong. Illinois, Beaverton School District. Great. Exciting to see some Ricks and BOCES. You play such an important role in data infrastructure and interoperability. We're so happy to have you here. Dubuque, Iowa, special place in my heart for Iowa. My husband was born there, so great. Well, we're going to get started. Folks will be joining and introducing themselves as they come into the room. Thank you so much for joining us today from Project Unicorn. I'm Erin Moat. I'm the Executive Director of Innovate EDU. And I am, yes, calling you from my closet today. I'm also the mom of 2 toddlers, 5 and 2. And so really my office criteria is there a door that locks? So welcome to my closet and welcome to this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the new National Data Privacy Agreement, security and interoperability, and how to really use the tool of procurement as a way to advance privacy, security, and interoperability in the K-12 education space. I am joined by just an all-star panel of folks today. I am super excited to have Al, Libby, and Larry join me for this afternoon. And we're going to start by just having each of them introduce themselves. And start with Al, then to Libby, and then to Larry. Al?
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Again, my name is Al Motley. I run Tech Academics and coming to you from Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Thank you.
Libby?
California. I work for California IT and Education as a resource program specialist. One of my big projects is the California Student Privacy Alliance, and I assist school districts and vendors to kind of get through this procurement process as it pertains to student privacy.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today. We're going coast to coast, Philadelphia to California, and then to you, Larry.
And then you get the heartland. Larry Fruth, Executive Director of the Access for Learning Community and the Student Data Privacy Consortium. Actually, I reside in Columbus, Ohio, so we get sort of more of the middle of the U.S. here. I'll talk more about A4L and SDPC a little later on, but thrilled to be with you today. Previous State Ed Tech Director in the state of Ohio, and then came to A4L and proud to lead the community as we're going to hit a couple highlights today.
Great. Awesome. Thanks again so much for this exciting group of panelists who's joining. Today, we're going to talk about the why of addressing privacy and interoperability. We're going to talk tactical. We're going to get tactical quick and talk about the how and how do we do that. Larry's going to talk to us a little bit about the new National Data Privacy Agreement, and then we're going to talk about why we should be doing this, both for school systems and for vendors. It's great to see folks in the chat introducing themselves. Thank you so much. Helps us really frame our questions, and it's wonderful to see members of the vendor community here today, as well as the school and state community. And then we're going to really finish up with a Q&A. And so as we're going through, I will be monitoring the chat. And so We won't be taking questions of the panelists throughout the webinar, mostly for accessibility purposes. But at the end, during the Q&A, where we're able to transcribe questions, we will be taking questions. But you are welcome to put those questions in the chat as they come to you throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure to hustle them all up at the end and bring them together. Really, we hope today you walk away with some learning goals and outcomes. We hope that you learn about the National Data Privacy Agreement and think about utilizing it in your work, whether you're a vendor, a school, a state, or a RIC or a BOCES. We really hope that you can learn about some of the tools that are out there for interoperability, some of the resources to help you guide that decision making. And we're really hoping you to build your toolbox with best practices and also some guides. You know, I think procurement is sexy. I always have. I used to say procurement reform is the sexiest thing that's a part of my job when I worked in the US government. But it's really the best way to set schools up for success and to define expectations and the relationship between districts, vendors, schools, and vendors at the beginning. And it gives you a structured process in which you can articulate your needs and your expectations and make sure that there's common agreement between the tool provider and the tool user. It also allows you to avoid costly, time-consuming, often frustrating conversations that might arise if you haven't articulated those expectations during the procurement process. A great partnership between a vendor and a district is like a great marriage. There's clear communication about who does what, and there's clear understanding about how information is flowing and what to do. So really important that thinking about using the procurement process as a lever to help make some of these decisions. So when you're choosing a technology tool and you are a school, a district, a state, there's so many things to consider. And one of the things that we believe very strongly at Project Unicorn is that you must consider interoperability and privacy side by side and together. And that interoperability without privacy is not the gold standard. And so we really would urge you to not just be thinking about, does this fit my use case? Is there an engaging user experience? But how do I get my data out? And when I get my data out, is the exchange of information safe and secure for everyone involved? So when we talk about that, that means that our procurements shouldn't just, and our procurement paperwork, our RFPs, our solicitations, shouldn't just specify the user requirements of our school, district, or state, but they should also really spell out what our expectations are around privacy and that agreement. And when we are able to use the procurement process to streamline not only user requirements and considerations, but also how we're going to implement this in practice and even how we might communicate this to other stakeholders when it comes to privacy and security, it makes the tool use so much better. I'm going to just say that interoperability for interoperability's sake is not what we preach at Project Unicorn. In fact, increased interoperability without consideration around privacy and security actually means increased risk for you as a user. And so you must think about privacy and you must think about data sharing as you engage in this work. I'm going to turn it over now to our friend Larry Fruth, Executive Director of A4L, and Larry's going to take us through some information and some really exciting new developments in this sphere. Larry?
Great. Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it. Thrilled today to be here just to talk a little bit about just one of the projects of one of the organizations that I helped lead and shepherd through to deliver. But this is sort of the real world that's happening out there right now. My whole family's still in education. I was a classroom teacher for 10 years, as well as the state agency. And wife's still teaching. My kids were on hybrid today. They were home today doing their work. So working with CIOs across the country, this is the reality that they have. They have to deal with all the different aspects to address, as Aaron said, privacy, interoperability, but there's a lot of additional components to that. They need to get those things in there simply and securely, and also hopefully very rapid because of the time frame that we're looking at as they're adding applications all the time. So our community is addressing all of these aspects in different ways, and we're just going to touch on a couple of them together. But today we're just going to focus on the tactical student privacy. And when we say tactical, about 5 years ago, Steve Smith, who couldn't join us today, who's CIO of Cambridge Schools, was one of the ones that he and I spent about a year just talking to constituents, whether they're vendors or end users at state, local, even ministers of education. And they were talking about privacy and what their pain points were. And there were a lot of great organizations, some on the call today, who do great things around privacy, COSIN, ISTE, SIA, DQC, Project Unicorn. There was a lot of conversations around schools saying, how do you help us get to where they want us to be? And so we're partnering with all those folks, and we want to talk about this as being tactical. Every time Steve and I do a webinar, which we do a couple dozen a week, we want people to walk away right then to say, I can go do this right now, and not something that you have to do a long-term planning for, but something you could address with your privacy right now. And that's really what this student data privacy came about. And Erin really hit it on the head when she said, in our community, we're sort of unique when I mentioned that I'm the executive director of the Access for Learning community, which focuses on interoperability, and I've been building specs, and I'll touch on that on the next slide. But with interoperability, everybody can get the data. And with privacy, the Student Data Privacy Consortium, no one can get the data if you don't want them to get that. So our community is really looking at how do you balance the two together? How do you make sure that you have both of them that can relate to one another? Let me go back and just touch on that. I thought we had another slide here. Just for level setting here, the Access for Learning community used to be called the CIF Association, started in '97 and builds technical applications with specifications for data to move between software applications. Just released a new spec, the Unity spec, which is going to help actually the privacy aspects of carrying some of the products of the SDPC. But that interoperability, every state has software vendors that are using the specs. It's openly and freely developed. If you're a little bored tonight and pull down the spec itself, if you like XML coding and about 900 pages of technical stuff, you could really entertain yourself. But I mentioned about 5 years ago, Steve and I started doing some homework around privacy, and we started a special interest group under that nonprofit umbrella of the Access for Learning community called the Student Data Privacy Consortium. And it basically has its own governance. AFRL has governance, SDPC has its governance. You could be a member of one, you could be a member of both, but the two have to be working together to be really delivering on what Aaron touted earlier, and that's interoperability and privacy considered at the same time. So that started about 5 years ago with the SDPC, and we're really proud of how much has come about since then. So this slide sort of represents our community right now under the SDPC banner right now. Actually, the two organizations together have over 3,000 members. And when I say members of the A4L SDPC community, we're talking school districts, regional service agencies, state agencies, government agencies, including the U.S. Department, ministries of education, as well as the vendors, the marketplace providers and suppliers out in the marketplace. We have communities in Australia, in New Zealand, in North America, and the UK. Each one of them dealing with their own data model and their own privacy issue, basically, but we leverage things across the community when we can. But 5 years ago, Steve and I started this tactical student privacy approach. And Steve really started this in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he was frustrated the fact that he had to deal with each vendor and his data privacy agreements one off with each vendor. And he actually built momentum after the vendor sort of denied him early to use the same one. But he built momentum in Massachusetts to a point where 50 districts in Massachusetts, including Boston, were using the same data privacy agreement that he was using in Cambridge. And so we started talking about, why don't we leverage organization in the state that wants to convene people around first data privacy and data privacy agreements and help their constituents address student data privacy. Each state's a little bit different. We really have sort of what we call top down, which would be a Department of Education sort of leading the way in that alliance. That's very rare. Actually, the Utah folks, I saw a bunch online today. Utah's one and Vermont's on. I saw representatives from Vermont here. Those are really the two alliances that the state agency are leading. The rest of them tend to be bottoms up, and that's a large school district starting their alliance, or most of the time it's a middle sort of driven where a COSIN, an ISTE, a regional service agency, some type of professional organization within that state is the point of the alliance, and then the alliance represents all those school districts that they serve. So currently we have 29, we have about 4 coming on board pretty quickly because of the topic for today, the National Data Privacy Agreement. And really what it started off was using Steve's tools that he built in Cambridge, which is called the Resource Registry. So you can go to the Resource Registry at any time, and I know we have some links at the end. You don't have to be logged in or anything. You can see what applications over 8,000 schools are using, what's there. You can actually click on the PDF of their agreement. You actually see all the numbers here, which are pretty impressive, of the fact of how many applications have signed agreements in that registry. And so each one of the states really built their own sort of data privacy agreement they were using in their alliance, or many of the states didn't have an agreement. Libby's going to talk after me, but Libby and California really started a lot of this because Texas, I can give you the Texas example, their group, the Texas K-12 CIO group, spent about a year trying to hone their own Texas one. And at the end, they said, let's just use California's. So they modified California. So each state was really using a lot of the California baseline of what they had in their alliances. And then interesting enough, about 2 years ago, the alliances got together and said, hey, why are we all using different ones? So it sort of came full circle around, why don't we gather together and build one? So we did that, our community, and I'm proud of this whole process going on because we had equal amount of vendors at the table as well as the end users at the table. But after about three years of this, we started putting together a common sort of baseline set of understandings of what the DPAs looked like across these alliances. We have a legal project team that actually started the conversation that was made up, again, of any members of the SDPC. And basically they went line by line trying to see what could be something that'd be palatable to both the vendors and the end users. And as Aaron touted and I tout all the time, the common expectations is the most important thing that we do on the A4L and the SDPC side. So they sort of embarked on this task of trying to develop one that maybe everybody can agree to. We talk about the other agreement aspects, and maybe Libby will talk about those when she talks about how California used the agreement. Oh, that's the slide that should have been earlier. Sorry, I already covered that. So let me just dive in real quickly and just give you an example. We had the old clause set, which really the 15 alliances were using these different clause set in their data privacy agreements they were using in their alliance as part of their terms of service with their vendors. So they were very common already. We had a starting point of the same kind of 28 buckets at least that everybody was starting from. So we started with a legal working group, and basically they worked hard, actually meeting every other week. It was actually led by Mark Williams of F3, who does a lot of the work in California and some other states. But F3 is instrumental and a partner of Libby out in California. And we had everybody meeting multiple times. And then we basically brought a product back. And it was a lot of to and go and to and fro, because there were some things that everybody didn't agree with. As you can imagine, vendors wanted something different than the end users felt they could address and deal with on the legal side. But it was a great set of dialogue and a lot of conversations of, no, we have to live this way. No, we want to live this way. So then we had the alliances take a look at it and basically say, is this going to work? And they did met every week for about 3 or 4 months to be able to do that. And so we then sort of spun off and put this thing out to the community for a vote or for comment and period. And it came back, and then we had a second bite at the apple. So everybody had 2 chances to get through it. I think the numbers, I don't have all the numbers, but we had a tremendous amount of all the comment period. And we went through all of them and said, yeah, this one's addressed. No, that one can't be addressed. But basically our goal was that consistency and that common expectations. As Steve always says, it shouldn't be this hard to get a application into an ecosystem, and the contracting process was something that was just very difficult for everybody to do. So those are sort of the goals of the project. When you look at the draft, and I know we have a link up of the draft, if you want to go to the SDPC site, A4L.org is the Access for Learning community, just A4L.org, the number 4. And then if you put just privacy on the front of that, privacy.A4L.org, that'll get you right to the SDPC site, and you can click on and get access right away to the National Data Privacy Agreement. It's very interesting how it was reordered, and I got to give kudos to a couple of the folks even that are on the call today about how it was designed. The design of it is actually great. The fact that there's a cover page, and on that cover page, there's a couple tick boxes, and the tick boxes says, if this agreement has an exhibit section at the end, as you can see down a little bit further, that people should go to see how it's specific to this state or how it's specific to this district. And that cover page is just common between anybody, but you click on if we changed it because there was a state need, we had to change it because of a state legislative need, or we clicked on it because the vendor and the LEA agreed that there'd be a change to it. That's another one of the exhibits you can do. And Exhibit E is a general offer of terms where if you sign with one Alliance member, you can actually offer that up to all the Alliance members in the states with a simple one-page sign-off. And I know Libby's going to touch on that as well. The rest of the sections in between is really all standard. You don't have to go in. We don't like the red line stuff. That's what we're trying to move away from. And then you'll have the exhibits afterwards, and then basically everybody's on the same pages, and we're trying to collect all of those state specific requirements and gather them up for the community and look at whenever the next draft's going to be, hopefully not very soon. So it was over a 2-year long endeavor that was really productive in the conversations. Is one of the projects of the SDPCs, but I think just shows how end users and the marketplace providers can get together and make life simpler for each other. And it's so funny, before we had this and we just had the alliances, the vendors were coming to me and saying, listen, I can't deal with these, 8 these different states who have the different agreements. And I would say, well, you used to have 16,000 districts using different agreements. So at least we're making it more streamlined as we go. The alliances, I'll just touch one more thing. The alliances right now are in different phases. They are taking the National Data Privacy Agreement that's only been out for a month and a half, something like that, and they are adding that exhibit where it talks about any state requirements they may have to that exhibit, and we're going to be starting gathering those, as I said. But some of the states are starting from scratch. I reside in Ohio. Ohio never had a DPA. They're using the National Data Privacy Agreement, and on Friday they'll be adding all their state requirements and gathering their alliance in Ohio to look at, does that work for Ohio? So this is just one of the projects basically, but this one actually is going to lead to another exciting project we don't have time for today, but it's actually called the Privacy Object Document. We're going to match these national clause sets with standards for security that are out there. We're not designing standards for security, but Steve's tool, you can actually link the two together and develop a machine readable privacy object document that an end user could give to a vendor and say, this is all the meta analytical data that I need about my contract fulfilled. And it should be automating this process. Again, trying to make the ecosystem go more smooth and quicker to get those different applications in. We also have a legal group that's working again on the next wave, which is going to be a common research agreement, hopefully, that we can get the alliances to agree on. And we have a legislative group because these alliances are starting to get phone calls from legislators saying, is this good wording? Is this bad wording? We're not to do legislation in our group, but we are trying to help the alliances answer questions about, yes, here's an example of a good one. Here's an example of a bad one. And a couple other working groups and another project called the Massachusetts Data Hub, which is actually going to require vendors as they enter into the ecosystem in Massachusetts to actually sign one of those privacy object documents. So the starting point, though, really was that registry. I encourage you to go in and play with the registry, check out what people are using, see if your applications are in the registry. And then the next step was this national DPA. So I'm so proud of the community as they put this all together. And I think I'll leave it there and let Libby and others make comments on it and ask questions at the end. So, Aaron, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Let's bring in some voices from folks who do the work in the field and who have really different perspectives on how this can work. And so we're going to first focus on this from the school's perspective. And I'd love to hear from Libby and Larry really around these 3 questions. Why is it so important to think about these types of agreements and in your procurement toolkit. Can you share some best practice approaches that have worked for you? And I will pause there, and then we'll go to the third question, which is around what tools should school districts really be thinking about in their RFP. So I'm going to go off camera. Al, Libby, and Larry, if you'll join, and we'll start first with Libby. Why do you think this is so important to engage these agreements in your procurement toolkit, and what approaches have worked best for you in California?
From the school perspective, I get to sit in a very unique position. I am in the administrator for the Student Privacy Consortium, or Alliance, sorry, Larry, at this moment for California, but I actually came from a school district, and my very first couple of years of interacting with the Student Privacy Consortium was from a district perspective. And so I know from experience how important it is, and how so we have compliance issues, especially in California, with all of the laws that have come down since 2014 to really govern the relationship that districts maintain with their vendors, and how that data is going to be treated, managed, and procured. And so having a procurement toolkit and a workflow for a school district to internally vet their applications prior to even accessing the contract between the vendor and the district is very important. We have to vet the applications for curriculum and education benefit, and now also privacy. So having a method in place to have that internal discussion with your teaching staff, your purchasing department, your technology teams, it's very important to have that in place at a school district prior to even discussing with a vendor.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think from my perspective, and this is Al Motley speaking, part of my work is offering high-level technology strategy to schools, districts, and education companies as an outsourced CIO CTO. So it's crucial in those instances where those schools typically don't have the high-level strategy in place, or there are something that's not the focus for them because they've moved to a place where they're going to online learning pretty aggressively and fast. So because of that, it's really crucial that they have the toolkit in three key areas. One, to control just as they look through all these different tools and they're trying to actually find and procure services for their students and their different stakeholders, there's a lot of overlap of services and overlap of the tools that they provide. If you look at some of the things that are options to schools, a lot of them are similar, but they all do different unique things well. So what schools are finding is that there's a lack of clarity on what they'll do and how they'll work and use them together. So really having a toolkit in place allows you to actually approach it in a way where you can actually collaborate and communicate an understanding of how you'll use them out to the rest of the stakeholders, whether it be on the administrative level, the teacher level, or even the student level as well. I would say also is just another thing and then that just translates well to just also controlling cost as well. Because I think a lot of the tools that are used are really teacher-driven in need. So then most people who use tools use it from their perspective as an owner of the tool. But who's actually managing the umbrella of all tools together to actually manage how they're working and how they're actually interacting together, or not? So I think then from there needs to be someone who's guiding that process, and the toolkit actually serves a great purpose for doing that, to give you visibility on how you're approaching it as well. And then I think the third thing is, I think it's just having these checks and balances of a toolkit helps you to mitigate your risk as well. Because I think the people look at the same way you would just procure a tool, and then also import student data into that tool. You gotta look at it as if the way you would approach applying for a credit card and putting your information online, and then therefore look at that as a process that actually, what could go wrong here or what can go right, even though a lot of our vendors and partners have done a really good job in recent years in doing that as well. So I think that's really great to see how those things come together.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is more process oriented from what we've seen be successful, and even my experience in the classroom. But one of the things is it really needs to be seamless for everybody involved, and that is, I'm a teacher. How do I access, or how do I ask for an app? And in the registry itself, Stephen, that Cambridge tool is very great. The fact that a teacher can go on their website and actually just ask for an app, and then it goes to whomever you designate it to down an email thread. So it may go to curriculum, it may go to the IT people, it may go to legal, it may go to some. You can determine where that goes to. But the key about that for me as a classroom teacher was I get an email every time it passes to the next step, which is critical because it used to go into a black hole when I was teaching. I was one of those teachers, like many teachers out there, I would beg for forgiveness and never permission because I knew it wouldn't get done very quickly. So sort of that, what's your role is really critical in making it seamless how this gets done. And then that role point is a professional development opportunity. And that's really, what is the teacher's role in student data privacy? What's the teacher role in asking for resources and vetting tools themselves, which is really critical around what's their role, and then being transparent about it all. And that is, even parents on the registry, if you go to the registry, there's a widget that actually put it on the front of the school website. So we're hearing schools say, I don't get the phone calls from parents anymore because they know every app we're using. They can see our agreement. They can see what grade level we're using it for. They can see all the things about that app. So for me, the toolkit needs to really include sort of a professional development. It needs to be seamless, and you really need to have what is the role each player has in it, and and not necessarily you may think is a toolkit component, but those are all seen very critical of what I would call effective practices.
And from a district perspective, I think Larry and Al, you both touched on this, and you have to get that teacher input because they are the users of the applications. But we also have to go through technology teams and departments to make sure the applications being requested are going to work within the network of the environment, as well as the procurement process with your CBOs or your business staff, and to save that cost. And so in California, we've developed an app vetting process that a lot of our districts have adopted. And that's a huge piece of this procurement toolkit. They have a team of principal with the buying power, your teaching staff, your technology staff, your ed tech trainers, and they all get together and they vet these apps. So teachers may request 5 different apps that are all 3rd grade math applications, and they come together and they decide, okay, let's pick 2 of these. And what you're doing is not just, like Al said, streamlining that process for what's being used and saving money and time, but you're actually helping students, because what happens is a student can move from school A to school B within the same district, and they lose a week typically to 2 weeks in some cases to relearn an application when they should be focusing on education. And so when we streamline that and we have an app vetting process, you're helping the students when they have to move from one environment to the next to streamline across as well.
Please one point out, because that Larry brought up about reaching out and speaking with parents and being clear with parents. One of our partners in Project Unicorn, the Center for Democracy and Technology, released a study today, this week, I think maybe a couple days ago, about parent perception relative to technology. And parents are actually welcoming more digital tools in the students' experience, but the thing that they're worried about is their students' privacy. And so a lot of openness in terms of attitudes, but how do we effectively communicate with our parents so that they know what tools we're using and that they're having that conversation. And as we get into our older grades, our middle and high school, how do we also use this as an opportunity to educate our young people about what information they're sharing online as part of their digital identity? I want to ask one more question as it relates to schools and districts. When a school or district is entering the RFP process, if you could think of 1 or 2 essential action items for them to do, make sure you do this before you release that RFP. Larry, Libby, and then Al, what would you say is 1 or 2 things that each school district should really have before entering that procurement or request for proposal process? Larry, why don't you kick us off, then to Libby, then to Al?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're just meaning all the aspects of an RFP. I guess we'll just stick with the privacy things. Really make sure they're well versed on what their role should be in student data privacy. As sort of a quick anecdote here, my wife teaches middle school French, and this is not a vendor, but this is actually a customer. But middle school French, her principal gave the staff a PD lesson on what applications they should do, and she said, just make sure they're FERPA compliant. Well, if you know anything about FERPA, the application can't be FERPA compliant, but don't laugh at that, because I've had at least 2 or 3 vendors call me and say, hey, this company wants to make my application FERPA compliant. So, make sure that the vendor knows what their responsibilities are, whether it's COPPA, FERPA, at least has a basic knowledge of not only the needs for around law and legislation on the federal side, but also state side. When I was the state ed tech director, I would get an RFP ready before they even got the RFP. At that time, right before No Child Left Behind, they had to understand what our state law was around our education law, and they wouldn't even get in my office until they knew what the law was. And that really fostered out a lot of different vendors. So I think the big thing is just make sure that you have some questions in there just regarding to privacy, and make sure that they have some understanding of what their obligations are and what their role is in the data stewardship from a vendor perspective. So Libby, I don't know what you would add to that.
Some applications, I mean, first and foremost, it's going to have to go through your ed tech department to make sure that the curriculum standards are being met, at that we're not just kind of frivolously purchasing every application. And then when you talk about privacy, you really have to make sure that somebody in the environment is checking what data is being collected. Is it necessary? Does it have to be shared and collected? And once that company gets the data, what are they doing with it? And so I always tell our districts in California, just because you sign the DPA does not negate your responsibility to just kind of follow up, double check. We have something called Exhibit B, the schedule of data in the DPA. And I tell the districts, this is your contract. Make sure that you have the vendor fill this out, and then have a discussion. It's okay to have a discussion around those data elements that are being collected. In the event of a data breach, the vendor nor the school district wants to have any extra data that didn't need to be out there in the first place, floating around, and we're having to kind of catch it all and kind of wrangle that beast back in. And so only share the data that's absolutely necessary to provide the service. And make sure that you as a district or a school know and understand why they're collecting that data and how they're treating it, how they're managing it, and how they're securing it.
No, those are both great points. I think the last thing I would add is there's one important thing I think leading up to that process that may not even have to do with the RFP process. A lot of districts or schools need to do something. I always work with schools is just around stabilizing their core. What I mean by that is really working on tightening the systems, tightening access and ownership of who's managing data in SIS and all your key systems around special education, student information systems, also things where there's any personal identifiable data information, and really trying to figure out, as you go into this process and work with them, how are you limiting or centralizing the way data leaves your district, or the way data is accessible, or the way data is stored and managed within your infrastructure. And that's really important to think about right before the RFP process. The second thing I would just add very quickly is that a lot of times we look at all these things and apply the same RFP process to all things. And it's really where our one filter is around how much they cost, and then really around the cost around how much effort we'll put towards it. I like to put tools in the way we RFP things in buckets around what's central to central core academic tools. Then there's supplemental tools. Then there's teacher pilot tools. And then there's always just operational one-off tools that even though there may be 5 people to touch them, a data breach from that level can actually be catastrophic for a district, even though you don't have as much impact of people actually accessing them. So I think if we can put those things into buckets and categories and then apply what resources, what are expectations, what are the actual data points they're requesting, which was stated earlier by the other colleagues around what's actually the threat what's the threat as far as data exposure if this were to have a breach, and really walk through that. And then I think the last thing I'll add is that typically businesses have had to think about this. are schools or organizations when you get cybersecurity insurance, but you usually have to do a data breach response protocol, and most schools just don't have that in place, and they don't. It's not something that they think about, or something we've had to think about as in working in education. But there's really good resources out there, and I'll find some to post around templates to do that. Like, what do you do in case there is a breach, whether you're at fault, whether a vendor's at fault, or you never know, your hosting environment's at fault. And then think through that. That way, it give you the lens of how you actually react, and that actually influences how you procure and how you look at these vendors when you're partnering with them. Because at the end of the day, they are your partner because it's a shared responsibility to protect your students' data and your staff data as well.
Case, Al, and I love the buckets around risk as well as the best insurance is to be prepared kind of thought. Thanks for sharing that. A couple of resources from the Project Unicorn team as we are thinking about this. So one is probably one of our most used resources in the Project Unicorn community, most downloaded, 10 questions for EdTech vendors, things you should be asking before you're purchasing. And this is a great way to have, a checklist for that conversation with those vendors. Go into calls knowing what you want these answers to be, and also feeling comfortable asking these questions. And if you're an EdTech vendor, salesperson, you're, no matter what role you're in, engineering, sales, you should be able to answer these questions, be able to provide guidance on these questions. Another is a great resource put together with our friends at ISTE, which talks about how are we better prepared for more robust considerations in purchasing technology. This doesn't just touch on privacy and interoperability. It talks about research-backed solutions and a whole host of other things. I'd really encourage you to consider this resource. There's also a quick guide that's only a couple pages that we also have access to. If you want the larger document, we are happy to share that and to send that out as well. I want to shift the conversation, and I know we have some vendors on the webinar to really think about this from the lens of the EdTech vendor community. And so many are partnered really well with schools and districts, partners of different alliances, and work closely hand in hand. But as you're thinking about these questions for vendors, what should they be thinking about from an inside sales and sales perspective as part of their toolkit? How should they think about the privacy agreement, Larry, in particular, as something that they should consider looking at in their policies? And what tools should they have as they're entering that RFP cycle? Let's start with Larry, and then we'll move to Libby and Al.
Yeah, I think that the best thing you just mentioned, Aaron, is that National Data Privacy Agreement. Again, it was put together by dozens and dozens of lawyers, EdTech vendors themselves, suppliers, marketplace suppliers, as well as schools and state agencies, because that really sets, as Al was mentioning, it really sets out what do you do in a data breach. Here's the rules that we have to go through. Now, it doesn't talk about the internal of activities of the school when there's a data breach, but it talks about the expectation between a vendor and an end user when we have those. I'd sort of just go back, Aaron, to what the last slide was, and that is, I always say when I do professional development, I want to know more about what they need than what they need. So if you understand the business of what you're trying to make a sales to in the education world, which is really complicated. If you're not in the education world, I've been in it my whole life and I'm still learning every day. But the more you can understand, the legislative laws, we could do this, we can't do that, the more well-versed you are entering into an RFP or conversations around trying to sell your product, I think that is really beneficial. And as hopefully the national DPA is allowing those common conversations to take place in a much more rapid manner, that we have the same expectations of each other. So for me, it just goes back to sort of my last answer as I deal with vendors, and it is becoming well well versed. One of the things that another anecdote from the vendor side is we get questions and calls and say we want to talk to you because we don't think we need to sign the DPA because we don't have any PII. We don't collect any PII. And Steve and myself or some other representative will get on the call, and all of a sudden we'll talk for 5 minutes and it'll be, oh yeah, you are collecting PII. So, you have to understand what PII is and how it needs to be implemented. How do you need to protect it? And if you even can collect it in the state that you're in, because there's a little bit of variance. So knowing their business of the school, I think, is the best beneficial thing I could say, Erin. So Libby?
First and foremost, I talk with just as many vendors anymore as I do districts about the DPAs. And partnership. It is a true partnership for all of these entities to come together, understand each other, understand their own workflows, process, policy terms, and be flexible on both sides. And so I think that's what's so great about the national and even in the DPAs that we have existing. It's not just from a district perspective. It's not just built and created from a vendor perspective. It's both sides coming together around a table and, truly partnering through the SDPC membership and having this candid conversation of what works for you, what works for me, how do we come together on these terms? Because at the end of the day, we all have to comply with the laws. And in some cases, and there's an amazing vendor on our call today, and I've worked with them personally to kind of have those candid conversations around the DPA was what started it. But really, this vendor and several others that I've worked with over the years, they actually care enough to take a look after being educated on the laws that we have to comply with in education and looking at the environment, how the products are actually being used. And they've had enough care and concern for their customers, the school districts, to actually partner and take a look and revise how their workflow is flowing through their business, and what their policies and privacy terms are and how they treat both of those. And so a true partnership is the best way that I can sum all this up. We have to be willing to be flexible and work together. And at the end of the day, if we can all come together, it's saving all of us time and it's saving all of us money. Because we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. We are working off of one contract and one idea, basically, that we all have to comply. How do we come together?
Yeah, that's a really great point.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think just one last thing I'll add is that I think from the vendor perspective, I think just thinking through that as you look at data interoperability and privacy, looking at it as something that contributes to your business model and your edge in the market and the way that you look at it is something that's really important. Right now, because of I think in the industry, the schools, the districts are really paying attention to now because of things like Project Unicorn and also the work that the fellow panelists are doing. So that is actually something that as we're looking at our toolkits, we're rating higher and higher as we look at things. So I would encourage vendors to look at it as really a business model, a strategic thing to actually really focus on those things and make it part of what they're doing. And then I would then say the one thing that I think that really helped from the school perspective is to make sure that there's clarity around security and privacy across all the different touch points that people that will talk to schools. Typically, there's a disconnect between the sales team, the customer success team, and then the support team. And typically saying, that's a good question, let me ask that and follow up with you, is not the right answer for schools when they're limited on time and trying to get through these procurement processes in a very efficient way. So I think just making sure that everyone's aware downstream and upstream from all the different people that can actually contact schools and work with them, that they're aware of all the important things around security, because that's something that's going to be asked in that initial conversation. That's what they're going to be researching when they're looking at that tool as well. And then that's when they make a decision. And then really think about, if we're collecting information, only collect the things that we want to show value back to the customer on, and not create a data lake situation where we're just collecting things because of what our future model may do to evaluate that data. I think that's really key to think through as we talk to the schools about the things that we collect, because usually they'll have required data fields, but then there's all this other stuff. Then what it actually value is that getting back to the school to actually give that data to get that data to you. So really show value in how you storytell and message around that, and that'll really build that trust between schools and the vendors as they move forward.
And I would add one more thing, and that is don't be afraid of this stuff that's going on, like interoperability, to tie them together, Aaron, a little bit. Interoperability, the standards, I've heard vendors say we like a lot of standards because that means there's no standards. And then the DPA people vendors push back, and Libby knows this. She's been on some war phone calls with people. But at the end of the conversation, 9 times out of 10, it's, oh, that's going to make our life easier. Or, man, that's the no-brainer stuff. Like a developer from a software company looking at technical standards, that's name, address, phone number. That's, doing the logistics of just where the kid is in the classroom. Oh, now I can focus on more of my teaching and learning, my content in my app, doing those kinds of things. So don't be afraid of standards when it comes to interoperability, or whether it comes to, because the Student Data Privacy Agreement is trying to take care of the no-brainer things we shouldn't have to deal with, and move on to the more creative things as we look to do these things with technical tools now that parents are even asking us to do.
It's a great point. I mean, standards are about creating the 80% common to allow the 20% custom. And that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice the custom attributes of your product that make it special, but it means that, if we get the base, we can get the custom so much stronger. Just calling out a couple tools. There's some great resources available for vendors who have signed the Project Unicorn Pledge, and schools and districts that have, signed the Project Unicorn Pledge, including an RFP and contracts library, which features across our partner spectrum a number of resources, model RFPs, model contracts, that type of thing. Again, trying to create a common set of language definitions that save folks time, effort, and money, including the resources for A4L. You can see they have 3 big ones at the top, but also some from our friends at COSIN and others. We also have the Project Unicorn rubric, which as you're thinking about where you line up in terms of a whole slew of technical dimensions around interoperability as well as security, for both import and export functions, share this with your engineering team, share this with your sales team, share this with your support team if you're a vendor. On the school side, please, and district side, please understand what each of these mean. Help think about these different dimensions of interoperability. When we have a shared language, we can just get so much better. And then, Larry, I want to just pass it back to you real quick to talk a little bit about something that I think has been the theme of the entire call, which is setting common expectations between schools and vendors. Libby really touched on this. It's all about the partnership. And so I'll leave you to share a little bit, and then we'll try to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Larry.
Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. I'd say that, I always tell everybody about 90% of my job when I have some challenges from our community, which again, our vendors and end users, is a lack of common expectations. With interoperability, I've told the story, I think Aaron's heard me say before, where I'll get the phone call on Monday from XYZ Corporation saying, do you see this garbage RFP that I got from XYZ, XYZ? And then on Friday, I'll get a call from the school saying, you see these garbage responses to the RFP that we put out from XYZ Corporation? It's just that. It's just a misconnection. There's just not common expectations. Well, think about how great it is with the National Data Privacy Agreement that you can go to California as a vendor and sign one agreement and setting yourself with the California National Data Privacy Agreement. And oh, by the way, then look at Massachusetts and say, oh, they're almost exactly the same. And in both states, really only sign just 2 of the DPAs, and you can have all the states who align to that done. I mean, see how simple that is. The schools have their expectations clear in the NDPA, and so do the vendors, and it just streamlines things. So it's really like, I think Libby hit it on. It's really about, that common expectations. And as you sign an NDPA, you actually, if you're a member of the SDPC, you get a badge, and that badge is going to lead us then to what we talked about earlier, the pods, where we actually can look at a pod. But none of this is anything mandated at all. So I want to make sure that you understand that the Access for Learning community doesn't mandate you use standards. The SDPC doesn't mandate you use the National Data Privacy Agreement. Every school district is the ultimate decider. So it's not even Libby at the state level. Although I can tell you, Libby's got her districts in California pretty militant about using them. So they'll push back against you. But again, we have some states, if you look at the registry, some school districts are using an application and it says no signed agreement. No signed agreement. Doesn't mean they aren't using it, but it just means they want to be clear to parents. They want to be clear to that vendor. They want to be clear to those teachers that we don't have a signed agreement for that one. In some cases, they won't let that be used. In some cases, they do. So again, this is not a set of mandates coming down from on high. This is basically a community collaborating together to try to streamline and set some common expectations between that. So Aaron, I'll get off my soapbox now and turn it back over to you.
Box, because it is around the call to action, which is you're no matter what part of the curve you're on, the supply curve or the demand curve, we really want you to consider looking at and using the NDPA in your work. Same thing with the Project Unicorn Pledge. We have a pledge for districts, commitment for states. We have a pledge for vendors and resources, including scholarships and the Project Unicorn Community, the Project Unicorn Matchmaker, and a whole slew of resources that are available in our community platform, which is, I think, so exciting. And we're excited to really be jumping in for our first full school year with the community platform fully built and up. Build your own procurement toolkit. So we've shared with you a number of resources on this call for your district, for your for you as an ed tech vendor going into the procurement season. Have answers to those questions. Ask those questions if you're a school district. Really build that toolkit that you have and understand what you're walking into. And then finally, setting communication here, common definitions, common descriptions can go a long way into really advancing the movement. We're really excited to have hosted this time. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. We'll be gathering handouts and tools from this webinar. We're going to hold Al to the data scenario planning one as well, and we'll bundle that up, have a digital backpack ready for you, as well as the recording of the webinar so that you can share it with colleagues and friends. If you have any questions for our panelists or for the Project Unicorn team, this is the time to put them in the chat. We'll wait to get some of those questions, and really excited to engage in conversation. Al, Lisa is asking if you'll repeat your buckets for data use. So you shared with us some buckets in terms of use case and risk. Could you repeat the way you really think about those buckets for Lisa as one of our questions? Al?
Sure, no problem. The buckets that I have are core instructional tools. So things like your learning management system, things that support that, like your student information system as well, or things where students or teachers are on consistently. The second one would be supplemental resources. So the things that are like curriculum or content specific that actually feed into the core tools as well. That's where you typically have a bunch of things that are very grade level or subject specific or special education specific, what have you. The third one was around teacher pilot tools, really the things that teachers will ask for that are outside, that may be touching really a grade level team or a specific teacher or two that you want to actually just pilot, get proof of concept and best practices, and then scale after that. So it actually defines for your team what actually will be used for. And then the fourth one were just, I call operational outliers. So those are things that things that are core key to the school operational, but may or may not touch all of your key stakeholders, and you think that there may be risk there.
Can you, Larry, next question is for you. Can you talk more about how Exhibit E works with the NDPA? Libby, you also might have some things to share here.
I will turn it over to Libby. She lives this every single day. So Libby, you want to take this one?
Absolutely. So the game changer is what I call it, is Exhibit E. Exhibit E is the general offer of privacy terms. So what that means is that if a vendor and a school district come together and they sign the agreement in its entirety, which is maybe usually typically about 20 pages. I think we shortened that, Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, for the NDPA. But anyhow, it is a cumbersome contract to have to go through and spend legal fees, etc. And so when that agreement is made once, Exhibit E comes into play, the general offer of terms, and the vendor will sign off on the general offer of terms at the time of originating signature, the time it takes place. And any district thereafter is what we call a subscribing school district. They can go into the database and they can review and find the contract and sign on to the same contract with the same terms that the vendor and the original school district have already agreed to. So that saves time, it saves money, and it saves both sides from having to do the additional back and forth. And so then you can more quickly and easily implement that application in your environment.
And every alliance right now, you'll sign their DPA, and that will be the Exhibit E opportunity. When the national DPA is now instituted, and California is going to probably be first, Libby's driving the boat there. Basically, you'll sign that one. It'll still be a California national DPA because they may have some state specific in the exhibits. You'll sign a Massachusetts national DPA, but the bulk of the contract itself is exactly the same, except for the exhibits possibly being different. So the Exhibit E will be an option there as well.
Well,
instead of each and every district, it sounds way more appealing to both sides.
Awesome. I love the efficiency. Procurement is sexy, right? Efficiency. Such a great group of folks. Thank you so much for joining. That's all for us today from the Project Unicorn team. We offer our thanks for being here, our gratitude for the work that you're doing. And I hope you are safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.